Good afternoon, this is Kristen, and I wanted to give you guys your Chapter 3 updates. Mostly what I'd like you to focus on in Chapter 3 is the digestive system portion. There's a lot of the chapter that, pardon me, covers the organelles and different organs and functions of all the different systems in the body, but my feeling is the digestive system is what we're going to be focusing on. So the reason that we have a digestive system is we actually have to break the nutrients down in food so that we can absorb them. And there's two types of digestion that happens in our body. One is mechanical digestion and one is chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion is just the process of moving and grinding and breaking the food down in that way. Pardon me. And chemical digestion is the use of enzymes that are secreted throughout the body to break the bonds of our food so that we can absorb them. So let's start with digestion in the mouth. What happens? We have the mechanical digestion of chewing the food, and we have the taste happening. You've got all the different taste sensations in your tongue. And then we also have some chemical digestion happening because we have a starch enzyme called amylase. It's salivary amylase that's secreted by the salivary glands into the mouth. And you can notice the salivary amylase when you eat a cracker and perhaps you just hold the cracker in your mouth and you don't chew it. You'll notice that it will dissolve over time. And that's not just because it's getting wet from the fluid that is there, but we actually have enzymes that are starting to break the bonds of those carbohydrates so that they are more easily absorbed. Our food then moves to the esophagus, which is done by taking the food into a bolus in the mouth, and then the tongue moves that bolus to the back of the throat. And then we have the epiglottis, which covers our pharynx so that our food doesn't go into our lungs, but our food goes into our esophagus. And it's a long tube, and it leads down to the stomach. And the action that occurs as it's going down to the stomach is called peristalsis. Those are muscle-like contractions that push the food down. So you actually could swallow your food if you stood on your head. You don't need gravity. And then at the bottom of the esophagus is something called a sphincter, which is like a door. And that door allows food to go into the stomach. So our stomach really acts kind of as a holding tank. So those sphincters or doors hold food into the stomach. Our stomachs can hold about 4 cups. And we have quite a few gastric juices in our stomach, things like pepsin, hydrochloric acid, gastrin, and these are some enzymes that continue this chemical digestion, mostly of proteins. We hold food in our stomach anywhere from 1 to 4 hours, depending on the type of food. And that mixture that ends up in the stomach is called chyme. It's a watery mixture of kind of starting to digest food before it moves to the small intestine. There is very little absorption in the stomach. So people often kind of refer to the stomach as the main digestive organ, but in fact, it's really the small intestine. The stomach really is just more of a holding tank. The stomach is an interesting organ because it has many layers, and the reason that that's important is that the acidity in the stomach is very high. The acidity of the stomach is about a 1, which is one of the highest acidity levels. So we have this mucosal layer that protects our stomach, and then we have several muscular layers, and that provides that mechanical digestion of the churning to kind of mix and grind some of that food. So as the food slowly makes its way into the small intestine, this little door, also called a sphincter, this is the pyloric sphincter, allows that food to be slowly released into the small intestine. And that small intestine is that primary site of absorption. And the reason being is that you see this right here, this highly absorptive surface called the villi, and then on the villi are these microvilli. One of the functions of the stomach acid is also to kill bacteria. If you think about that, before our food gets into our small intestine and gets absorbed, we want to kill any bacteria that may be on our food. So that high acidity level in our stomach does provide that. This is an example of the peristaltic action moving the food mass down. And now when the food is in the small intestine, this is the primary site of absorption. The small intestine is about 10 feet long, and that's without all the villi stretching out. If you were to stretch out all the villi and microvilli, it would be approximately 26 feet long. So very long, large absorptive area so that we can absorb the majority of our nutrients. And that's to increase that surface area. And what's interesting, with that large surface area, we get about 95% of the food is absorbed in the small intestine. So that small intestine really works to use the enzymes that are released from the pancreas, okay, into that small intestine. And those enzymes just continue to break down the nutrients into smaller and smaller particles. This is the villi right here. And as the food particles get into the villi and the microvilli, all of this blood exchange allows that diffusion to happen. And here is an example of this intestinal absorptive cell, and which is right there next to the bloodstream, right on the microvilli. So once the nutrients get into that cell, those nutrients can then get into the bloodstream. And that's how we get our building blocks. So 95% of the nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine through the microvilli and the villi, passing those broken down nutrients into the blood. The blood then travels to the portal vein, which is the vein that leads to the liver. And the liver is really the organ that kind of decides where those nutrients go. Carbs are typically absorbed as glucose, proteins as amino acids, and fats are a much larger molecule, so those need to go from the small intestine into the lymphatic system before those larger fat molecules are able to be absorbed. So this is a kind of visual representation of those nutrients being absorbed. This is the inside of the small intestine, and these nutrients that are broken down, they get transferred into those absorptive cells, which transfer it into the blood. So what happens in the large intestine? Well, now you only have about 5% of food stuff left, and this is typically fiber, which most of that is indigestible. Then there's water and electrolytes. There's no villi or enzymes, so it is not an area of absorptive capacity. There is mucus, and the reabsorption of water and electrolytes like potassium and sodium happens. And then we also have a plethora, millions of good bacteria that are in our large intestine. And what's ironic is those good bacteria really feed off of the leftover digestive particles, which are the fiber. And it's one of the reasons that people have a much better healthy gut and healthy immune system when they have a high fiber diet, is that bacteria really eats off of that fiber. So bacteria in your gut may not sound good, but it really is good. And then the rest of that fecal matter is absorbed, is formed into a solid mass and excreted. So again, I want to go over the nutrients that are absorbed. So very little in the mouth. There is some carbohydrate breakdown, but then the food goes down into the stomach, and there's very minor amounts of nutrients absorbed in the stomach. But once you get down into the small intestine, you look at this. This is the site of the majority of those nutrients. Now, the large intestine, there's a lot of fiber that is left over, but you do have some absorption of electrolytes, a little bit of fat, and then again some of the water. And the rectum is where the stool passes through and eliminated. And again, this is less than 5% of what you ate is actually eliminated. So what kind of accessory organs are important in the digestive system? Well, there's the liver, which we already talked about. The liver is important for kind of sending the nutrients to where they need to be. This right here is the gallbladder. The bile is actually made in the liver, and bile helps break fat down. And then it's stored in this gallbladder, and then it's released into the small intestine when the presence of fat occurs. The other organ is this pancreas right here. And the pancreas is responsible for a multitude of digestive enzymes, which is really important in the small intestine, as well as some of the hormones like insulin and glucagon. So the liver empties bile into the small intestine. Well, it actually empties it into the gallbladder, which then empties it into the small intestine. And that the pancreas, and like I had mentioned, empties those enzymes into the small intestine. The two hormones that I mentioned. And one other interesting note is I had mentioned the stomach acid of the stomach is very high. It's a high acidity level of about a 1. But what's interesting in the small intestine, it's actually a basic pH because there's so many enzymes, which in fact are proteins, that pH level has to be a much higher pH level so that those enzymes don't get destroyed by the acidity. And the component that the pancreas produces and secretes is called sodium bicarbonate, and that actually raises the pH. So now you're not in an acidic environment, but you're going towards a basic environment. The urinary system is where we get rid of excess urea, which is a byproduct of protein metabolism, and excess water. So how do we store nutrients? Well, we have one of the best mechanisms, which is our adipose tissue. We actually don't store much carbohydrate. We store a little bit in our muscles and some in our liver. About maybe 200 to 500 calories of glucose is stored as glycogen in our muscles, and about 1,200 calories is stored as glycogen in our liver. Other than that, we turn everything else into fat. We don't have a storage form for amino acids. So if you're eating a high protein diet and your body doesn't need those extra amino acids, your body breaks that amino acid part off, makes it into urea and excretes it in the urine, and then the rest of that molecule is made into adipose tissue. And that is all I have for the digestion for this week. There are several discussion topics that cover things like gluten-free diets and probiotics that I think would be interesting for you to review, as well as there is a digestion video that you can watch to reinforce some of the principles that I just went through. All right, have a great week. Thank you.